My Brother Sam is Dead, Chapter 14. There was nothing to do now but wait and see what General Putnam had decided, so we waited. Betsy Reed came down to the tavern a lot, and we talked over a lot of plans, escape plans, and all that kind of thing, but none of them seemed very good. A week passed. On Saturday, February 13th, Colonel Reed came up from encampment with the word that General Putnam had refused our plea for clemency. I began to cry. It's just so unfair. He fought for them for 3 years, and now they're going to shoot him for nothing. Colonel Reed shook his head sadly. I know, Tim, he said. I know. War is never fair. Who chooses which men will get killed and which ones don't? He touched my shoulders. You have to accept it now. Be brave and help your mother bear up. She needs somebody now. But I didn't feel brave, nor did I feel like bearing up. All I felt was angry and bitter and ready to kill someone, if I only knew who. Sunday's church service seemed specially important, so everybody could pray for those souls of the men who were going to die on Tuesday. Mother refused to go. Instead, she sat calmly by the fire, sewing. We're required to go, Mother. I'm not going, she said. They can murder who they like, church who they like, but I'm not going. For me, war is over. I went. But after a half hour of sitting in the balcony where I sat beside Sam for so many hundreds of times, I began to cry and I walked out. Nobody tried to stop me. I guess they knew how I had felt. We closed the tavern early that night. Nobody was there anyway. I guess nobody wanted to be around us. It was too gloomy. I would like to close the place forever, Mother said. I hadn't noticed that she stopped drinking rum, for it was already over and there wasn't anything left to be nervous about. It was Father's tavern, I said. I won't serve any more Continental officers, she said. Never again. Never. I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep that night, and I didn't think Mother would be able to either, so I threw some extra logs on the fire, and we pulled up chairs in front of it. We've got to think of something, Mother. There's nothing, she said. Let the dead bury the dead. He isn't dead yet, Mother. He's still alive. He's dead, Tim, she said. He's dead as your father is. No, I said. I got up and took Father's bayonet down from the wall over the mantelpiece. Then I went out into the kitchen and took the steel out of the rack and began to wet the bayonet. Mother didn't get up. She didn't say anything. I worked over the bayonet a good long time until I had an edge on it that would slice through a man like a hot nail through butter. Then I went out to the tap room and put on my coat. Mother didn't lift her eyes from the flames snapping over the logs. Going to get yourself killed, son? I'm going to save my brother, I said. No, you're not, she said in a soft, whispery kind of voice. No, you're going to get yourself killed. Well, you might as well. Let's have it. All done with at once. How does the old line go? Men must fight and women must weep, and you'll get no more tears from me. I'm done weeping for this war. I stared at her. Then I turned and went out the door, buttoning up my coat. There was plenty of moonlight left, shining on those fields of snow. It was almost as bright as daylight. I didn't dare walk along the road. You never know who might be coming along. This meant that I had to work my way through the woodlots and along the hedgerows and the pastures where the snow had not been packed as hard. It was as it was on the road. Fortunately, it had begun to pack itself its own weight, so that my feet sunk in only a few inches with each step. It was funny. Nothing seemed to bother me. I didn't feel tired or cold or worried. My head was sort of out of focus. I didn't have any plan. I knew I ought to think of one, but I couldn't really get my mind working. All I could do was just keep going on until I came up to the encampment and then see what I did next. Finally, I came to the line of trees that ran along the ridge of the top of the encampment. I dropped into the crouch and slipped from tree to tree. There wasn't many of them left. Soldiers had cut most of them for wood and lumber and firewood. Then I came to the last tree, just over the edge of the ridge. I stopped and stared down. The ridge sloped down sharply for about 100 yards. The line of huts ran along the bottom, with the muddy road alongside them, and here and there a cannon or a wagon standing. There were corrals for horses and livestock, but hardly any people. Light came out of the chinks and cracks of the buildings, making slashes and dots in the snow. The stockade was dead in front of me. I stared at it. The little hut, just like the others, was surrounded by a 10-foot-high fence. There was a guard standing at the corner of the stockade, but he didn't seem to be too alert. I figured he'd be cold and thinking about getting warm and not keeping too close to watch around. I still hadn't made my plan, but there didn't seem to be many choices. About the only thing I could do was slip down there, kill the guard, open the gate, and let the prisoners out. And if he spotted me first, I could try to fling the bayonet over the fence and hope that Sam could get himself out in the confusion. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was the only one I could think of. The trees had been cut off the hillside between me and the stockade, but there were plenty of stumps and boulders scattered all over it. I figured if I was careful, I could slip down from one to the next until I reached the bottom. Down there was an empty space of 50 feet or so between the last stump and the stockade. I just have to make a dash for it. I figured that the snow there was bound to be packed down pretty hard. Not bad for running. I began to slip down the steep hillside from the stump to the boulder. I went mostly on hands and knees, getting pretty soaked in the snow. I kept an eye out on the guard. He didn't seem to be looking around much. I was nearly at the bottom of the slope now, but I was still high enough on the hillside to see over the walls of the stockade. I stopped and stared. I couldn't see anybody moving around. The prisoners were all inside the hut, staying warm. I figured, although I didn't think that they would be doing much sleeping, I wondered whether you cared about being warm if you knew you were going to die soon. I decided that you probably did. I glanced at the guard. He still wasn't moving much, so I slipped the rest of the way down the hill behind some boulders until I was at the edge of the open space of snow. The stockade was now only 50 feet away. I stared at the guard. He didn't move for several moments. He was leaning on his musket with his head bent forward. I suddenly realized that he was asleep. I took the bayonet out of my belt and clutched it tight in my hand. If Sam could kill people, so could I. I decided I'd go for his throat if I could, so he wouldn't make any noise. I raised up a little. My heart was pounding. I took a breath, and my breath was shallow and my head was shaking. Then I stood up and charged out from behind the boulder across the empty space of clear moonlight, my feet going crunch, crunch in the snow. The guard stirred. I drove my feet faster. He jerked his head and stared at me, sort of dazed. I slammed forward. "Halt!" he shouted. He swept the musket up, and the bayonet pointing straight at me 20 feet away. I jerked to stop. "Sam!" I shouted and said, "Sam!" again, as loud as I could. The guard lunged towards me. I lifted the bayonet and threw it into the air. It flashed in the moonlight, spinning lazily over and fell into the stockade. Then I turned and began racing as fast as I could across the snow for safety of the boulders on the hillside. I had gone only 3 paces when the musket went off with a terrific roar. I felt something tug at my shoulder. No more than a tug. I dashed onto the slope and then began staggering upward, zigzagging from boulder to boulder to keep protection at my back. Behind me there was shouting and running and the sound of a horse being wheeled around. Another musket went off, and then another. I heard a ball smack into a stump somewhere near me. Now I was getting near the top. I struggled on, my breath rasping in my throat, and then I reached the trees at the top of the ridge and flung myself flat. They'd never get me now. They couldn't gallop horses in the snowfields. I was too far ahead of them to catch me on foot. I rolled over and looked down. 2 or 3 soldiers were starting to struggle up the slope. There were men running everywhere, the horses being saddled and the officers shouting. I stared into the stockade. There was no action there, no people moving at all. Lying in the center of the square of the snow, something shiny glistened in the moonlight, and I knew it had been a waste. The prisoners weren't in the stockade anymore. They had been moved to someplace else. I clutched my shoulder where it was bleeding a little and started for home, running all the way. Mother was asleep in her chair in front of the fire. Quietly, I took off my shirt, looked at the wound. A ball had skipped right across the top of my left shoulder. A little chunk of flesh was gone. My arm felt numb, but nothing seemed to be broken. I washed the wound and dressed it, and then I hid the shirt with a bullet hole inside of my mattress. I figured they might be able to guess who'd thrown the bayonet into the stockade, but nobody would be able to prove anything, and I went to bed and fell asleep immediately. Mother refused to go to the execution. I went. I knew Sam would want somebody there, and besides, somebody would have to claim the body. They had built the gallows up on the hill to the west of the encampment. A crowd had gathered around. I waited down the road until a troop of soldiers came by. First came the drummer playing a slow roll, and then the troops, and then Sam and Edward Jones riding in the cart. Their hands were tied behind their backs, and around their necks there were ropes that were tied to the cart too. Behind them were more soldiers. General Putnam was going to make sure the troops saw the execution as an example. "Sam!" I shouted as he went by. He looked around at me. His face got dead white, but he managed to give a grin. Not much of one, but a grin. Then they passed on by. I waited until the last of the troops had gone through, and I ran up to where the crowd was standing and began to push my way through. When people saw who it was, they let me pass. I pushed my way up near the front of the crowd, but not all the way. I had a funny feeling that I wanted to be hidden. I didn't want to stand out where people could see me. They had all already gotten Edward Jones upon the platform of the gallows. They had put a sack over his head, and a rope dangled from the gallows an arm above. A soldier slipped the noose over his head. My eyes were misty. I couldn't see very well. Nathaniel Bartlett, a Presbyterian minister, stepped up onto the scaffold and said a prayer. Then he stepped away. I looked down at the ground. There was a funny thump, and the crowd gasped. I looked up. Jones was hanging down below the scaffold on the end of the rope. His feet almost touched the ground, but they were sort of dancing. I hadn't seen Sam, but now they brought him out from somewhere in a bunch of soldiers. They sort of shoved him into the empty space in front of the gallows. He had a sack over his head, too. I wondered what it was like to be inside of that. Was it hot? Did it itch? Mr. Bartlett came out and said another prayer over Sam. I tried to pray myself, but my mouth was dry and I couldn't get the words out. They turned Sam sideways to the crowd. 3 soldiers stepped in front of him and raised their muskets. They were so close, the gun muzzles almost touching Sam's clothes. I heard myself scream, "Don't shoot him! Don't shoot him!" At the moment, Sam slammed backwards as if he had been knocked over by a mallet. I never heard the guns roar. He hit the ground, his belly, and flopped over on his back. He wasn't dead yet. He lay there, shaking and thrashing about, his knees jerking up and down. They had shot him from so close that his clothes were on fire. He went on jerking with flames on his chest until another soldier shot him again, and he stopped jerking. Epilogue. I have written this story down in the year of 1826, on the 50th anniversary of the founding of our nation, to commemorate the short life of my brother Samuel Meeker, who died 47 years ago in the service to his country. I am 64. Although I hope to go on living in health for some time yet, the major portion of my own life is spent. It has been a happy life and a successful life for the most part. I no longer live in Reading. After Sam's death, I hated the place and wanted to go away, but the war went on for almost 3 more years, and while fighting was on, it was difficult to think of building a new life in another place. For the first time in months after Sam's death, I was not able to do much more than the basic chores. But time heals all wounds, and by the next fall I had become used to the ache in my heart and began to think about what I should do with my life. I started to make a study of calculating and surveying with Mr. Heron, who was kind and didn't charge me for lessons. When the war finally ended, Mother and I sold the tavern, and I moved out to Pennsylvania, where new lands were opening up and surveyors were much in demand. After moving around a bit, we finally settled in a town of Wilkes-Barre. We built a tavern there. I began buying and selling land. With the profits from this activity, I built a sawmill, and then a store to go along with the tavern. And then I joined with some other men to found a bank. I married and had children, and with work in God's will, I prospered, so that I am able today to enjoy my children, my grandchildren, my orchards, and my gardens in peace and comfort. Mother never really got over Sam's death. She kept her vow, and so long as the war went, and she refused to serve the Continental officers. I had to do it myself. She lived to a ripe old age, and even at the end she would frequently ask of him in conversation or tell stories about his headstrong ways to my children. But she was tough in spirit. She survived to enjoy her grandchildren and her new life. She left her mark on the history of our country. It will be, I am sure, a great history. Free of British domination, the nation has prospered, and I along with it. Perhaps on some other anniversary of the United States, somebody will read this and see what the costs have been. My father said, "In war, the dead pay the debts of the living," and they have paid us well. But somehow, even 50 years later, I kept thinking that there might have been another way, besides war, to achieve the same end.